Then there's California, a podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their lives, legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that help make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. As you know, the legislature has returned to Sacramento in this late winter in pandemic fashion for the start of the 2021 legislative session. Many lawmakers returning to continue their work on California's policy priorities and needs, some legislators re-elected for another term, and some who are arriving in their respective legislative houses as freshman senators and assembly members. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll talk to one of our freshman state senators, sworn into office last fall, but one who fits that freshman label only in the most technical, logistical sense of the word. And it's a description that belies this lawmaker's truly deep well of legislative, public policy, fiscal leadership experience, and state capitol memory. John Laird was elected in November to represent California's 17th Senate District, including his hometown of Santa Cruz and the county of the same name, as well as San Luis Obispo County and slices of Monterey and Santa Clara counties. Mr. Laird's first lawmaking streak at the state capitol took place at the beginning of this new millennium, when from 2002 to 2008, he was the assembly member from his hometown of Santa Cruz and surrounding hamlets, and was chair of the Assembly Budget Committee. From then until now, John Laird has been one of California's environmental ambassadors, serving as a member of the California Integrated Waste Management Board and environmental policy instructor from his alma mater, UC Santa Cruz, and most recently, from January of 2011 to January of 2019, as California's Secretary of Natural Resources during former Governor Jerry Brown's second act of governorship. Before all of that, way back in the day, John Laird was a community college trustee, served on the Santa Cruz City Council, and most distinctly served 2 terms in the 1980s as the first gay mayor of the city of Santa Cruz. It was my privilege to have worked with John Laird during my time and his in the State Assembly a decade and a half ago, and to now have the pleasure of working with and for him again as a state senator. And what an honor to have him join me on this podcast. And we are here in this vacant State Capitol Committee room, socially distanced at this long glass table. Freshman Senator John Laird, welcome to Then There's California.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you, Brian. It's like old times.
It is. It is like old times. Well, welcome back to the Capitol. You've never really left the Capitol, so I guess I should just say welcome back to the legislature. Does it feel new, or is it more like a same carpet colors, different people? How does it feel?
It would be same carpet colors, different people if it weren't for the pandemic. The odd thing is that I have 4 offices. I have the Capitol office and 3 district offices. And except for one person that's allowed to come in the Capitol office with me, we're the only ones in any of the 4 offices. And so it's really disorienting. And the swearing in was such that friends and family couldn't come. Some of the members participated remotely. I even gave the prayer at the swearing in session because the chaplain wasn't allowed in the chambers. And so that is just really disorienting, because usually right now you're getting to know your colleagues, even though I know most of them already, and you're spending time with them, and that is just really difficult. You're doing it very briefly in person, but mostly by Zoom.
And the place is so quiet.
Well, it's hard to believe, because there were times in the mega bills that I'm sure we remember with not always fondness, that the Capitol was so jammed you could not move.
Right.
And I recall one, the spay-neuter bill, when I was in the Assembly, where I was budget chair, and my office was on the 6th floor, and there was a hearing room there. And to be able to get to my office, I had to go to the 5th floor, cross the Capitol, go up a back stairway, do everything, because I couldn't just get through the normal route to my office, because everything was blocked and clogged because so many people were in the Capitol.
Right. I know you were in campaign mode all of last year, but how did you survive and thrive in your pandemic year of 2020? How did you do
Well, 2 things. First, I retired. I turned on my retirement, so I worked for Gavin Newsom for 1 day and then retired. And I have never run for office before when I didn't have to work. And so it was amazing. And then my real race was the primary, making sure I got through. and then we lock up a week after the primary.
Yes.
And I, except for 3 or 4 nights, was with my spouse for 10 months. We just hunkered down. And the one thing that I don't think I've ever talked about is, you see, I am a family history junkie. That is my hobby. I am the family historian. And so my retirement project was to put up a web page and go public with all the research so it had a place to stay. And since I'm flunking retirement, the minute I realized this was going to go on, I engaged a local person that was a friend of mine that does web design, and I spent 3 months getting an intense website up. And then I had no time to work on it. I had these loose ends to touch. So New Year's weekend, knowing my life was just going to go away, I went up with a family history website.
And you never would have had time to do that had it been just the average typical natural resources cabinet member, lawmaker
Well,
type
there's
of work.
this story that the first Saturday after I was not secretary, I was home. I was able to do my taxes. We took a walk. We went out to dinner. I made some phone calls. And I looked at my spouse and I said, geez, was I busy on Saturdays? And he gave me that look like, oh man, you have to ask.
That's right.
And it was, it was just so noticeably different being my own boss, being at home. I actually kept my own calendar for 2 years. I went to San Luis Obispo 25 times before the primary, and it's 2 hours and 30 minutes from my doorstep to the city limits.
Oh, wow.
And so it was just a different world.
Speaking of family history a little bit, I read somewhere that your mother is still alive
Yes.
and thriving, bless her heart.
She was 96 and a
Still
half
reading
last
headlines
week.
and asking you? 96,
Oh, yes.
wow.
Yes, she reads the Chronicle cover to cover, and she calls and she says, is this true? She really wants to know. We're very lucky to have her. She's in assisted living where she has her own apartment. And so she lives by herself, but people look in and congregate meals. But she's been locked up for 10 months. And there was a period of time that we could go into the adjoining city park. This is in Pleasanton. And she would come out to the courtyard and we could socially distance visiting her. But the initial lockdown was total. And then they locked back down, but she got her shot about 10 days ago, and we're really relieved.
That's
so
great.
She's finally on that
Well,
track.
happy birthday to her, and glad she's thriving and doing well. So you're back here in the Capitol, in the upper house. Reflect on this, notwithstanding the atmosphere with the pandemic, on how the Capitol, the legislature, the policymaking atmosphere has changed from your first days in the Assembly back in the 2000s. Just give me some reflections on the last couple of decades.
Well, one of the things is that term limits changed and then changed again. And so I was in the Assembly in the 6-year term limit. I never would have had the option if there weren't term limits, but I hated to go when it was done. And now here I am, back 12 years later, and of 120 legislators, I only served with maybe 3 or 4 when I was here the first time. So even though I know them all from when I was secretary, it's almost a complete turnover, a
Sure.
different world. It's not like there's this consistency. And the fact that the term limits changed in a way that people can be in either house for 12 years and 95% choose one house, there's a little bit more stability in the sense that people are allowed to wade into issues, to have time to develop the knowledge. I mean, when I was in the Assembly, some people ran for the Senate and the 4-year term didn't hit right, so they would run in their 4th year in the Assembly, and they would start running at the beginning of their 3rd year, so they barely found out where the bathroom was,
right.
And they're already moving into their next race and trying to do the next seat. So staying there 6 years and not running for something at the end of it was, for the Assembly, this remarkable stability. I was budget chair for 4 years, and that just was unheard of in those old term limits. And so that's really what's made it different, both in terms of who's still here and in terms of how long people can stay and whether there's some stability in the House.
I want to take you back to your home in the 17th Senate District, which has been your home base for decades. The 17th District is one of California's crown jewels. But its demographics are very diverse and a real study in contrast. You have the beautiful coastal mansions and the tourist destinations, but you also have the fields and the harvests of Monterey and San Luis Obispo counties filled with essential workers. So there's a lot of different economies and needs. Share some perspectives of the lives and landscape of the 17th Senate District and how your beautiful home base has evolved over the decades since you planted roots there.
And to even add to your description, it has 10% of the city of San Jose at the north tip, and then it goes to the San Luis Obispo, Santa Barbara County line. I always say that it's 3 hours and 15 minutes to drive one end to the other if there's no traffic and you're going slightly above the speed limit. And there are 21 cities. And yes, there's 1 million people in San Jose, and it has 10% of that. And then the next largest city is my hometown of Santa Cruz, which is approaching 60,000 people. And then it goes down from there. And so there's this diversity. Everything is in the district, from a real urban center in the Silicon Valley to the ag fields, to university towns, to beach towns, to ag towns, to little tourist towns. And so there's just almost nothing that isn't there. And I was talking to a colleague of mine who represents just to the north, and he was telling me how wonderful their vaccination system was and how everybody needs to do it the way they did it. And I said, you don't have farm workers. We've got 40 to 50,000 that are going to arrive from the COVID hotspot in Yuma and land in Salinas in the Salinas Valley next month.
Right.
And so when we look at priorities, they have to be in the priority. And so it is really challenging to balance out all the interests that exist.
There's so much I want to ask you, and I have a lot of these then and now types of questions, which I actually think serve a valid purpose here because your institutional memory is vast, and I think it's valuable to hear the perspectives about both the past and the present, and also what it means for the future. First, keeping things personal a bit here, for you as a gay man, a member of the LGBTQ community in this state, and having seen the arc of change and the fight for equality on a state and national level over the decades. And as I mentioned, you were the first gay mayor of Santa Cruz back in the 80s, and in the early 90s, you were the director of the Santa Cruz AIDS Project. And I know that was a real heartbreaking and sobering time for the community, not only in this state, but across the country. And then you came into the legislature as your LGBTQ caucus colleagues, Mark Leno and Jackie Goldberg and Sheila Kuehl and Carol Migden, all were fighting the battles for equality in job protections and legalization of domestic partnerships, the legalization of gay marriage in this past decade. Even public schools now are required to teach the history of the LGBTQ community. So you have been an eyewitness and a key participant personally in this, I guess you could say, this jagged line of progress towards LGBTQ parity and equality. Talk about that journey.
Well, you captured it when you said the arc of history. And when you think that when I graduated from college, it was illegal to be a gay man in all 50 states. And I was in the Board of Supervisors chambers in Santa Cruz in the mid-'70s when we became the first county in the nation to ban discrimination on its own employees, and I was just a newly minted one. And I was elected in 1981 to the city council, and there had to be maybe 10 openly gay officials in the entire United States. And
right.
So there are more in the Monterey Bay Area now than there were when I was first elected to
And
office.
probably a blessing that you were in Santa Cruz County, right?
It was, but it didn't mean it was any less of a challenge. And you have referenced I was the first openly gay mayor of Santa Cruz. Well, actually, in 1983, I was in the class of the first three openly gay mayors in the entire United States.
Wow, yes.
And there was something strange. It was all about beach towns. It was Santa Cruz, Laguna Beach, and Key West. And it's really interesting to look back because one of the stories I like to tell is when the Milk movie came out, I really didn't want to
about
go
Harvey
see
Milk,
it.
the supervisor.
Yes,
yeah.
I didn't want to go see it because I knew how it ended, and I didn't think it would be particularly enjoyable. And I'd met him a few times. I'm taking a lot of crap for being 45 years older than the youngest member of the LGBT caucus right now. There's a San Francisco newspaper that has focused on that. And yet I said, yeah, well, I'm probably the only member of the caucus that actually met Harvey Milk. And I knew all the people around him. And when I went to see the movie, I was surprised with one takeaway, which is there's this scene in the movie where the police are just regularly going into bars and busting them up in San Francisco. And this is in the late 1970s. Harvey Milk organized people to respond whenever that happened, to show up in the bars and to be a counterweight. So the thing about it is you look back through where we've been. Yes. And so I feel like there's this incredible accomplishment. It's wonderful. Rights exist that we never thought would exist. And when I went to the movie, I forgot what it was like then, because I'm just looking through the prism of what it is now. And then one other observation based on what you said, because I just moderated this forum for the Santa Cruz Library. They have Santa Cruz Reads, and every month they read this book collectively. So they asked 3 of us that were involved in the HIV response in Santa Cruz in the 1980s to come and talk about it. And I moderated this forum last week on an hour and a half one evening, and it was the same thing. I mean, I was telling the story that when I ran the AIDS Service Agency, there was no dentist in Santa Cruz County that would see anybody with HIV. So our dental program was transportation vouchers to San Francisco. Oh, wow. That is how we dealt with people doing that. People were fired from their jobs for working with the AIDS agency. I had to author a non-discrimination ordinance at the city council level. There were lots of things from that period. And so now, you know, I pinch myself sometimes. There's so many people I wish had lived to see where I am now. They would just be amazed. I had this one thing happen when I was in the assembly that's apocryphal in this way. And there's this guy I know, this young gay guy that's gone on to Harvard and a big success. He was going to Sacramento City College, and he said, we're doing a fundraiser for the debate club, and we're going to do Howard Zinn Reads. Would you be one of the readers? So I said yes, and they gave me a couple things, and there was this Vito Rousseau. He wrote this book on the celluloid closet that was the definitive work on sort of gays in the film. And he was active in ACT UP in the 1980s in New York City. And there was this New York Times editorial that said, don't worry about HIV. It hasn't got to the mainstream of the population. And he writes this fiery piece about, well, what are we, chopped liver? And he does this thing. And I think, oh, that's the right piece to read. And I'm in front of this crowd of 200 out at Sac City, and I get about a third of the way into it, and I can barely continue. I don't know how it reached in there. Every word, my voice cracks. I'm struggling to get to the end. And it's like I tell the story that I didn't even lose it when I was speaking at my father's funeral, and this, for some reason, it was still there, the times were still there, and when I struggled and I finally made through. I was so relieved. I sat down, and they cheered for about 2 minutes, and I was like, what are you doing? It's like I just sort of opened up a vein and like had a rough time. Leave me alone.
But what an authentic moment.
I think it's just, yeah, and it's just that time is hard. So I had a 25-year-old staff member that watched this Santa Cruz Reads forum that I did last week, and he sent a message afterwards. He said, I had no idea that was what it was like. That was all news to me. And so it's sort of like just being there for the arc of history. And I joke sometimes that I feel like Zelig. I've been in all these, I've lived long enough. I've been in all these places, you know, just witnessed history.
Kind of a Walter Mitty-ish kind of
exactly.
Yes.
And because you never think that you will become, even at a very minor level, a historical figure. You're just living your life as it comes at you. And I think the other night, it was really, we all just stared straight into it. It was one of the 2 events that turned me into an adult. I'd been able to conveniently be narcissistic and not have to face death or other things as a young person. Between that and the earthquake in Santa Cruz that destroyed our downtown and closed it for 2 or 3 years when I was on the city council, those 2 things, I think, forced me to live life and face reality.
I don't think that I have ever heard or read your coming out story. It obviously is a coming out story and a coming of age story that I'm going to assume has a lot of different context and different dynamics than the coming out story of say, a young millennial here in the 2000s. Can you share that story?
Well, there's a couple of pieces to it that are very interesting. One is coming out to my parents, which was one of the hardest things I ever did in my life. they were stunned at first, and they wanted me to go see a counselor, and I really pushed back and said, no, you're the one that's having the issue right now. I'm fine. And they finally, to make me go away, agreed to go to a counselor, but they never did. And the funniest thing that happened is, you see, I have two brothers, and my brother that's 2 years younger, who I'm closest to, is also gay. But at the time I came out to my parents, he hadn't told them yet. And so my mom, in her just South Dakota unwitting way, says, geez, we always thought your brother might be. We just never thought you were. And I wanted to say, he is. He just hasn't told you yet.
But you knew that would open up a whole can of worms.
Yeah. And you see, and one of the funniest things is my brother's been with his partner for 42 years. He has the longest standing relationship in the family. And my brother just decided the way he was going to come out to them was to just bring him home for Christmas one year. And I remember when they walked in, I thought, oh, this is going to be good. And my brother said to him, don't worry, they're from the Midwest. They could be shouting inside, oh my God, but they won't say anything. And now he is a beloved member of the family, my spouse is. And then the second half of the story is the political coming out. And I really worked hard. It was really difficult. This is 40 years ago. And nobody had press conferences. And the whole notion of a press conference saying I'm gay was just freaky to me. And so when I ran for the city council, I listed affiliations that were gay, and the daily newspaper left them out, thinking they're helping me. And I'm like, God, I just can't figure this out. So when I was a little bit in on the city council, and I'm being considered to be elected mayor, I sat down for an interview with a reporter from the San Jose Mercury News. And he sits down. We're at this restaurant at lunch in downtown Santa Cruz. He just sits down, looks at me, and says, are you gay? And I said, yes. And then there's just this complete silence. And he says, how will it be to be the first gay mayor of Santa Cruz? And I smiled and said, the first openly gay mayor of Santa Cruz. And we both started laughing. And he said, who are the others? And I said, you're on your own. And then over the course of 2 or 3 days, I just became a media event all over. Everybody picked up the Mercury. I was on the Paul Harvey News, sort of like page 3. You won't believe what they've done out in Santa Cruz, California. And it led to a whole host of interesting things. One of my favorite stories is, of all people, Bruce McPherson, who I later served with in the legislature, was the editor of the paper. And so the day after I'm elected mayor, they referred to me as the gay mayor. And so I called him up and I said, you went 110 years without saying somebody was the straight mayor. I am the mayor. Yeah. And they dropped that. And the other last part of the story is that we that are in elected office are viewed to be self-centered a lot of times, and we don't think of other people. Never occurred to me that my parents hadn't told their friends that they had gay sons. And suddenly I am beaming into their city on every news outlet. And my other brother calls me with this hilarious thing, and he says, well, it's like a funeral around here. People are bringing casseroles. And then my mom, who was an elementary school teacher, got this letter from a fellow teacher saying, I always snickered at what's going on in San Francisco, and I snickered at Harvey Milk, but I know you, I know your husband, I know your son that lives at home. Clearly this son came from that. It's a loving family, and I'm just going to have to rethink this. And so it was a good thing for my parents. They were in a good place, but it caused them to be clear and open. And There was one campaign I had later that somebody did a family values thing against me. They had all their pictures of their family, and they did all this stuff. And so I forget that my mom was subscribing by mail to our daily newspaper, and she just shows up in the Santa Cruz headquarters one day unannounced with all these family pictures. And she says, well, where do they think you came from? And it was like, oh, Mom. And then there was a time, I think when I was in the assembly, that she gave an interview to a gay newspaper. And I went, you gave an interview to a gay newspaper? And so it was one of those coming out experiences where it's not just you that comes out.
The whole family does.
Yeah, everybody's along
the community
for the ride.
Does, yes.
Yeah, and I think it was a source of pride for so many people in the community.
That's wonderful.
And a real source of pride for people that were struggling with their own families. And I got just constant feedback like, thank you. One person who was out And she was not out to her family. She gets a call from her family, and she says, well, we see you have a gay mayor. And the next thing she knows, she's in a conversation with her family. And so there was just lots of things like that. And now I went to this schools meeting of, they have what they call gay straight alliances, which are school kids that organize. And this school kid says, oh, yes, when I came out in the 4th grade. And I was like, you came out in the 4th grade? What's happening in the world? You know, and yet all that is happening. It's happening in a different environment. And it's not like the struggle isn't over.
Absolutely not.
There's kids that get bullied. There's trans issues. And then there's this bizarre issue that has led in part to a piece of legislation that I just
thank you for that segue. Yes.
Yeah,
and see, this is the benefit of being the oldest member of the LGBTQ
There you have it.
caucus.
There you have it. Yet when I called the reporter in San Francisco that was giving me crap about this, I called him and said, this is the dean of the delegation calling to do this to you. And so the thing about it is now we have the problem that people are aging and going into assisted living and feeling like they have to go back to the closet.
Who are living with HIV in
yes,
particular.
as well. And so I have done this bill because it was always our dream 35 years ago when I was working on HIV that people would live to old age with HIV. And now it's happening. It has gradually become mostly a chronic condition, and it is treatable in certain ways. And so now people are aging, and so I have a bill because there are certain priority categories in the Older Americans Act for services, and I have a bill that prioritizes seniors with HIV in those priority categories for the Older Americans Act. And it's an amazing bill to do because just on the face of it, it's the statement that is being made about where we are.
Absolutely. And a couple of decades ago, 40 years ago, something like this would have been unimaginable to the community, thinking, wow, if somebody's HIV positive in their 70s, 80s, even into their 90s.
It was generally viewed, rightly or wrongly, as a death sentence in the 1980s.
Yes. I talked to your colleague, Senator Scott Wiener, during Pride Month last year, and he told me some of his coming out story growing up as a young man in New Jersey and in the New York area, but fearing death and also being a Jewish gay young man. He had support from his family, but still being in the community and having to keep that, if you will, closeted. It's just extraordinary how far our country has come in these years.
Well, we have monthly calls of the caucus, morning Zooms. They normally would be in person. And we had this one, and, you know, there is this 45-year age difference with Alex Lee, the youngest, and me. So we had this Zoom, and it was a day or two after the Georgia Senate election. And on this call, as we're bantering before we get to business, I said to Alex Lee, I said, do you know what the TV series Designing Women was? And he says, no, never heard of it. And so I proceeded to say, there's this one scene in Scott's home area where there's this TV bar, the Midnight Sun, that's been there for 40 years. They used to run it over and over again. And this character, Julia Sugarbaker, always would do these rants for a minute or two. And so her sister was this parody. She was a beauty queen. She was Miss Georgia. And apparently in her competition, she did the fire baton. And she did the fire baton. She threw it up, and it went into the rafters and knocked out the power. And so she runs into somebody that's in the restroom that's making fun of her sister. And so she does one of those rants. And the key moment is that she says, and so, Marjorie, so you will know, and someday your children will know. That's the night the lights went out in Georgia. And she has her bent over. And Scott says on the call, I really appreciate you educating the next generation on cultural references. Yeah. and then Scott proceeds to say that the first night he moved to San Francisco in 1995, he unpacked and he went to the Midnight Sun, the video bar that would show this over and over again. So there were all these circular references. It tied in Scott. It tied in the next generation. So more than you probably wanted to know.
No, this is delightful.
It's color.
And who knew that we would be talking also about Designing Women? Dixie Carter was a great actress, and that was a great show.
Exactly.
I could talk to you for hours about this, and I know you have to run here in a while. We'll get to a couple of extra things here if we can. We cannot talk about that crown jewel of the 17th Senate District without talking about climate change. The coast, your farming communities and the broader impact that climate change is having here in California. As mentioned, your environmental and climate change creds run deep. And whether it's the devastating wildfires that we've had or coastal erosion and flooding, the impact of climate change is happening in real time here in our state. California's policies have been and are ambitious and trend-setting, but from your perspective, from all of those vantage points you've had over the decades, is it enough?
No, it is not enough, and I think the big challenge is we take things off in bite-sized pizzas rather than looking at the whole and making sure we're doing everything at the whole. And California has done a great job. They are the trendsetter of the 50 states. We have set goals that are ambitious, and we have met the first rounds of them. But, for example, when you talk about the district, there was this experience last August that was really scary, which is we had a fire that burned within a couple of miles of my house in a temperate, fog-based coastal community, and it was unfought by the state for 3 or 4 days. So it was burning through rural residential areas without essentially being fought. And there was a time 77,000 people were evacuated. In the end, 925 homes were lost. I have a lot of people I know that lost their homes. Yeah. And for a time, it was burning towards Santa Cruz, and the only thing that was there was our fire department at the city limits. That was it.
Yeah.
And one big wind, and it was into town. It was miraculous that it sort of laid down enough that people could stop it from getting to the city, but tragically there was incredible loss in the mountains. And, you know, in Paradise, that fire, which happened while I was still secretary the last few months,
right, the Camp Fire,
it moved at 60 acres a minute. You could not physically outrun that fire. We had 1 million acres burn in California between the 1920s and the turn of the century in 2000. We had 1 million acres burn in 1 week this past summer. Yes. And so we did things about units for controlled burns and prescribed fires. We did, in the Brown administration, 250,000 acres, different ways you did forest treatment or fields management. Gavin Newsom has really upped the ante in a good way, but we're doing it year to year in the budget. So I'm going to have a bill that sets forth a 10-year framework for how we're going to tie all these things together and set goals for 10 years. And we also have this thing that right now we put, I think, if the statistic is right, roughly 95% of that money just goes to state agencies. It doesn't go to local fire safe councils that are doing all this stuff on the ground across the state. We have to figure out how to change that. So I'm wading right into that part of it.
That's fantastic to hear, and I would love to hear more as you go into this. I know you and your colleagues are looking at this not only from an environmental climate change issue, but a fiscal issue, because if we keep going like this with these crises every year, we could bankrupt the state just in wildfire suppression.
Absolutely.
And fighting.
And I think it took 80 years to get here because there were all the fuels that were left on the ground by going with fire suppression, but it butts up against climate change, and that what I was talking about how fast fires move and how hard they burn is also, it's not just the way fires have not been fought or not been done in a century. It is also climate change intersecting with that. So it's going to take a while, but we have to turn it around and head in the other direction.
California is dealing with so many crises right now, several of them pandemic-focused. The conflicting nexus that we've seen between the pandemic needs and the state government assistance, we can see it play out in no worse way than the circumstances that we're seeing with California's Employment Development Department and the millions of Californians that are left without a job in the wake of the pandemic and desperately needing unemployment benefits. The legislative staffers, the folks you have working for you and your colleagues, they have become these sort of ad hoc EDD employment counselors to thousands of these constituents who are out of work, who can't access their benefits. They're crying. They're threatening suicide. This is just desperation all around. So a question not easily answered, but who or what is to blame for all of this, and how can this trauma be stemmed and we reach some sort of equilibrium?
Well, it's just an unmitigated disaster. And as I said in my comments to the audit committee, the audit on this was damning. It was just damning. And so I'm going to do a bill that is one of the recommendations out of the audit, which answers your question, which is we need to have a recession plan consistently for this, because this happened in the Great Recession in 2009 and 2010, and there was an audit that made the same changes, and now it's just happened again, and we were nowhere. We were not ready, and I could spend another 45 minutes just talking about the personal disaster of what has happened to people in this. People living in cars that are being repossessed and having their phone taken out, and they can't even get a message to tell them whether the benefits have come, on and on and on. And so we really have to do that recession plan as one good government thing to make sure that while we're cleaning up this mess, we never get in the mess again.
I could talk to you for hours here. I know you don't have that time. I'm really grateful. One final question here as we wrap. Zooming out and looking back at California in the macro, and we consider the challenges that we have with wildfires and dealing with the pandemic and the fallout from all of this. Every so often there are these stories about California that you see in the press about the new millennium dystopia here in our state. People and companies and businesses are leaving in droves, and our climate is scarred, our quality of life is fragile. I initially would dismiss a lot of those stories, but now I read them a little more seriously. We have a special place in the state, the bellwether of our country, but because of that, we have to hold it to these higher standards because it is failing. That the change has to occur not only in the halls of legislative power where you work, but the power is also in the streets too, as we've seen this last year. So not to be chronically dramatic about this, but from your lens as a lawmaker, as an early progressive, as an environmentalist, can it be saved? Can California survive to its full promise?
Yes. And the thing about it is people were saying exactly the same thing about the time Jerry Brown was elected governor the second time.
The second time, okay.
Yeah, he said it's ungovernable. You just can't do anything. And bit by bit, he balanced the budget for the first time in decades. He paid off the debt. He revised the criminal justice system in a way that had less people going into prisons. He dealt with the roads that hadn't been dealt with in 30 years and making sure they were financed. He led with climate change and did the world-class cap and trade and the renewal, even though we would prefer some standards that aren't cap and trade. It works as a piece of the puzzle. He did all these major things. And so he showed that, in fact, it is governable. You can do things. California can lead the way, and now it's just different major crises that have come to the fore. Affordable housing is one you didn't mention, and the housing crisis.
Absolutely.
As well as climate, as well as the jobs housing balance in general, as well as making sure there are enough education slots and they're affordable, making sure the education system is relevant. We just have to do exactly what he did 10 years ago in the same way with some new, different problems, and we can do it.
I will take that faith and move forward with it. John Laird, thank you so much for this time. I appreciate it. I know it is a busy time, and you've got to move on. It's been great to have this conversation on a personal and legislative level with you, and I hope as you get back here and it feels like you've never left, hopefully it's all in the good ways.
It is. I really appreciate being here, and I know that there's so much we didn't get to that I'll be back.
That's what I was going to say. I hope we can have a sequel here for this podcast. State Senator John Laird from Santa Cruz, representing the 17th Senate District, the Central Coast, and the Valley, and that is a wrap for this edition of Then There's California. We are a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, Rainier Sabiniano, Gunjan Patel, McLeana Woods, Lisa Murphy, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of newly elected, but not new, State Senator John Laird of Santa Cruz of the 17th Senate District, I'm Brian Green at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Be well, everybody, and thanks for listening to Then There's California.